Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Terry Bouton, and we're going to talk with Terry about a lot of things, focusing especially on his 2007 book, Taming Democracy, the People, the Founders, and the Troubled Ending of the American Revolution. But first off, Terry, thanks so much for joining us. Was hoping you could introduce yourself and also explain what led you to write Taming Democracy.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you for having me. Yeah, no, I started out. I came to graduate school as a 20th century labor historian, and then pretty quickly fell in love with Black history and was interested in doing something in the civil rights movement. I was actually looking for a topic that was kind of on the overlap between those two fields. I was having a really hard time finding a dissertation project. Last semester of classwork, I took a course with Peter Wood in colonial American history. He knew I was looking for to do something on I was interested in democracy and social movements. He handed me a book on the Whiskey Rebellion and said, "Here you go." The study of, I think, a lot of social movements, particularly the revolution as a social movement, I found to be pretty backwards with how social movements were studied in other periods of American history, just not receiving the same kind of attention, receiving a lot of condescension from authors who were hovering way too high above the subjects and dismissing what these we get a lot of farm petitions. People were talking about how terrible things were and devastating, and they're losing their lands and property as a result of the conditions, and those concerns were largely dismissed. And it turns out nobody had done the real work of going down and investigating whoa, what exactly is going on. Is what these people saying, is there validity to their claims, or are they truly paranoid or lost in some provincial, the whole idea of the revolution bound up in conspiracy theories and the rest of it, is it just that? And I found out, no, these people knew exactly what they were talking about.
I'm excited to dive in. You focus heavily on Pennsylvania and then bring in the federal constitution. And of course, it's a story about what becomes the United States. I was curious why colonists in Pennsylvania used words like oppression, tyranny, and even slavery to describe their condition under British rule. And maybe another way to put that is to ask what conditions brought Pennsylvanians together during the 1760s and 1770s, and then would ultimately lead to them rebelling.
The reason they're using terms like oppression and tyranny are centered in money. That Britain is going to create this economic crisis that's going to lead to an ideological and a constitutional crisis. All these things are not. It's not one or the other. These things are integrated and intertwined in ways where you can't separate them. And to understand that, you kind of have to understand that Americans of the revolutionary generation, they lived in colonies that lacked a natural supply of gold and silver. If there was gold here, the area would have been taken by Spain when they showed up, or France when they rolled through. But because there's no gold and silver, they moved, they went elsewhere. And so colonial governments without natural supply of gold and silver are forced to print paper money to serve as a medium of exchange. And those currencies are so important that they form about 2/3 of the money supply, more in some colonies, less in other, with about a third of it money supply being gold and silver. And so the context for this is the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And Britain decided that, colonies are fighting this war by printing their own currencies. They print a lot of them. I think it's a 9-year war in the colonies. There's great inflation during the war. And Britain decides that the inflation is the responsibility and blames the colonial governments for printing too much money. And their response is to pass a law in 1764 called the Currency Act, which prohibits the colonies from printing new paper money, which is in effect killing 2/3 of the money supply, of the traditional money supply. And that already throws things into chaos. So the currency contracts, you have a deflationary spirals, and people are forced to rely on just the 1/3 of the money supply that was gold and silver, which they say we can't do. And then Britain in 1764 also enacts the Sugar Act, which is going to make the problem worse by enforcing a closed system of trade called mercantilism. So you've got to just buy from Britain and sell to Britain. Gold is supposed to flow from colonies to mother country, not the other way around. And so the way that the colonies used to get their gold and silver coins was by trading outside of empire, smuggling. Technically, it was smuggling, like we were a nation of smugglers or colonies of smugglers. And so now they find they can't get gold and silver coins like they used to get. Britain's killed 2/3 of the money supply that was paper money. Now you have to rely on, saying to colonists, now you have to rely on gold and silver coins. But British policies are like eliminating the supply of gold and silver coins by saying you can't get them the way you used to get them, which was smuggling. Then on top of it all, then Britain starts taxing the colonies in gold and silver coins through things like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Like these taxes are taxed in specie, in gold and silver, which the colonies don't have. And so they're telling Britain and petitioning, saying like, we don't, like, this doesn't add up. You are killing us. Like you are slitting our wrists and bleeding us dry by killing paper money, and then you're slitting the other wrists when we're bleeding out. They're writing petitions in all caps in parts of these places to sort of explain what's going on. But when this happens, the economy shuts down. People can't pay their debts and taxes. They're hauled into court, and a lot of the anger was focused on things like the Stamp Act, which the Stamp Act, as we know, like taxed newspapers and playing cards and licenses, but it also taxed court papers. And so you've got thousands of people across the colonies who are now being hauled into court for debts and taxes that they cannot pay because of Britain has eliminated the supply of paper money, and now they can't get gold and silver, and they're losing their property and sometimes losing their farms. And now they have to pay a tax. Like when they read the text of the Stamp Act, it's pretty clear we're gonna have to pay taxes on all of the slips of paper that go to divest us of our property, that the courts are going to use to take away our property. And so people were so angry about this that when the stamp collectors show up to open up their offices, they get shut down across the colonies. They are explaining this crisis not just in terms of like you're killing the economy, they're also explaining it using the language of republicanism and explaining that this is violating their rights as Englishmen under the British Constitution. So it's not just material, it is also at the same time ideological and economic.
What sort of organizations are they creating, or how are people in Pennsylvania coming together to attempt to solve this? You mentioned, for example, gentry led committees, another group, the Rural Black Boys, who blackened their faces in disguise. What sort of groupings came together to try and address these things?
Yeah, and this is where we get into, I think, a really important question about how is the American Revolution organized? Like, how is it mobilized? Who's doing what? And it's to try to understand it as a movement. And a movement isn't just Thomas Jefferson tells you you're oppressed and therefore you will fight again. Like this takes a long time to mobilize, and it mobilizes in different ways. Some very class specific kinds of ways in which this mobilization happens. You'll have a lot of the elite, the gentry led committees who are looking to follow order and the established rules for complaining about policy. So they're petitioning, they're lobbying, they don't want protests. These are people, the colonial gentry is fairly aristocratic. It's filled with wealthy and powerful people who are doing pretty well under the status quo, who might be angry at British policies, but don't really want to upset the social apple cart too much. On the other hand, you have many ordinary Americans who are facing the brunt of British policies, and the effects of that are hitting home and small farmers in particular really hard very early. And these folks are ready to go. Like they want something done. Their leaders are not taking steps that they think are fast enough or appropriate enough or challenging Britain enough. And so they sort of take matters into their own hands and begin protesting over the objections of many of the colonial elite leaders. And it's here you sort of start to get this sort of dual revolution happening, right? Not just the revolution for home rule and independence, but also a revolution, the famous phrasing over who shall rule at home. As they're questioning, Britain and using Republican language, saying, oh, Britain is concentrating economic and political power in ways that are threatening our liberty. And you get even elite leaders making those kinds of arguments, that we are the oppressed colonies facing off against a wealthy mother country and its wealthy colonies like India or Jamaica, and we're sort of different. We're the poor ones in the family, and we're being oppressed. But you see many ordinary Americans, once they start using that same kind of language, they're applying it not just to the British Empire, but they're also applying it to their own societies and saying, like, yeah, if concentrations of economic and political power are dangerous to liberty, we've got some pretty big concentrations of power here. The other thing that republicanism is doing and Republican language is doing is it's creating a new idea, not just of citizenship, but of public service and of political leadership. And it's saying that leaders should be working for the good of the whole, not for their own self-interest, not to be self-interested, but they should put the people first. And it's challenging what is a monarchical and aristocratic vision of political leadership, where it's okay to make money off of your use of government and your political office. A lot of political offices were offices of profit under monarchy, right? I mean, those offices are what's used to structure the monarchy. That's how monarchy creates itself. Its source of power is the patronage it gives out, the different jobs and offices, and the lucrative positions that it dispenses. And Americans start questioning that, and ordinary Americans before elite Americans, and beginning to define these terms of the revolution in ways that are distinct from these aristocratic gentlemen who are, so that we imagine, or the traditional narrative has as leading the way. And certainly they were leading in terms of running some of the big committees and the big mainstream organizations. But a lot of the energy and the dynamism of the revolution is coming from below, from people who are challenging that. And what you find is a lot of elite leaders having to adopt positions they're not entirely comfortable with, because they recognize they're in the minority. Like, they recognize their interests are being threatened, and they're trying to hang on to power and desperately worried about losing it. And so you find ordinary folks relying on methods of protests, forms of rough music, 18th century protest, where, it would be very festive and loud, the tarring and feathering, the getting tax collectors, making them go from house to house, doing a shot of alcohol at every place they pass. And if they're very proud, having them humiliated in some way as a way of knocking them down off their social pretensions, which many ordinary people see as, like, that's how they think they're better than us. And they think they're better than us, and they act better than us, not just in terms of their haughtiness, but in terms of their policy. That kind of popular pressure, crowd citizenship is grows out of monarchical Europe. That's the protest of monarchy and living in a monarchy. And I think that's our big sort of beginning of these kinds of struggles, and between these two groups. There's not a lot of support for republicanism among the revolutionary elite. There's, in fact, initially really strong attempts in those initial 1776 constitutional conventions to perpetuate monarchy, like to create monarchical governments. And then when they figure out that's really, really unpopular, like that's a non-starter at these state constitutional conventions, then they said, like, well, okay, we'll try to create aristocracy. It's not a question of, like, them saying, oh, here's the Republican model and we'll follow it. And they all, like, Thomas Paine provides it, and the rest of the elites, like, oh, wonderful. Like, they can't stand Thomas Paine. Like, they are terrified of his vision of republicanism, and they're going to fight against it. So you watch them sort of trying to keep it as monarchical or aristocratic as they can in these new governments. So you get these weird hybrid governments that come out of in these new state constitutions, which are in some ways, moving in a more Republican direction, but also have these aristocratic elements in them to try to preserve the power of the elite. There's this idea in the traditional scholarship that everyone loves the king up until 1776, right? American colonists, they're mad at Parliament, they're not mad at the king. But then somehow Paine publishes Common Sense, and everyone's like, oh my God, like, what, like, love the king, because Paine says, the monarchy's evil, and Britain is a monarchy, and it has the evils of monarchism in the king, and it has the evils of aristocracy in the House of Lords, And we need to get rid of that and create an authentically Republican government that represents the people without the check of aristocracy and monarchy on them. And he's saying, like, throw out 2,000 years of philosophy, and like none of that matters anymore when we think about the past republics and democracies in the past. He's like, they're not really, like, this is new what we're doing here. This is a new moment to begin the world anew. And that's what he's saying. He's basically, but that's meeting somebody like John Adams, who and the rest of these who have been schooled since the time they were children to think that a mixed monarchy like Great Britain's is the greatest form of government the world will ever know, and that the lessons of 2,000 years of history tell us that, and that all of the great philosophers going back to Aristotle tell us that that's really the only form of government that's going to work, and republics all fail. And Paine says, no, they haven't even been tried. Let's try this, and gives a formula for it. Elite Americans are not turning around and saying, oh my God, I was wrong. My whole education was like wrong. It's not like, John Witherspoon, who's teaching at Princeton, doesn't turn around and simply change his curriculum. He teaches the same thing he's been teaching. He will continue to teach that, like, mixed monarchy is the best form of government for the rest of his life into the 1790s. That doesn't happen. Does it happen? It happens with the public. Like, we get American people who are like, yeah, like ditch monarchy and aristocracy. Yes. And we have an elite who's like, no. That's the only thing keeping us from chaos and disaster, is the fact, if we can, maintain these monarchical controls in government, maintain aristocratic controls in the government. And so you see in other places, like, them pushing for a Senate, that they're all saying, like, this should be like the House of Lords. If we can't have a king, if we can't have governors with absolute veto power and prerogative authority like the British king, we can at least have a check on the people in the forms of an aristocracy, right? So they ditch monarchy and jump to aristocracy as the only thing that's going to save them, even recognizing they all believe that aristocracy as a pure form of government is going to fail too. They just think it's going to do better. It'll fail, it'll last longer, and won't be as damaging when it fails as a republic would be. But in Pennsylvania, the ruling Quaker elite, they don't back down. They refuse to get behind the revolution. They refuse to get behind independence, and the revolutionary movement in Pennsylvania kicks them out. Like, they create their own organization outside of the colonial assembly. It is filled with people who were not necessarily, they're not poor people, but they're people from a wider variety of backgrounds, further down the social ladder, who are interested in republicanism and creating a republican government. And that's basically what they do. They create a unicameral, like, they take Paine's model, which was of a unicameral house having all the power, which the argument was, under the British system, you would have something like a Senate, i.e. a House of Lords, to check the people, right, in the House of Commons. You have a monarchy, which checks both the aristocracy and the people. And he's like, if you're getting rid of monarchy, the evils of monarchy, and you're getting rid of the evils of aristocracy, you get rid of that powerful executive, and you get rid of a Senate and give the power to the people. Because otherwise, what's the check? What are you checking and balancing? It's the people checking the people. And that's not, like, it's not the people checking the people. It's going to be rich people checking the people. It's going to be the aristocracy checking the people. And so Pennsylvania follows that, creates one big unicameral house with no property requirements for office holding, no Senate. The governor of Pennsylvania is very weak, has no veto power, and is really just there to be an administrator of the government and laws, like, to administrate the laws, but doesn't have real power to be able to do that. They expand the electorate by dropping property requirements for voting. Now they have a taxpayer requirement, which meant if you paid any kind of tax in the past, you can vote. And this is going to enfranchise about 90% of adult men, and not just adult white men. Like, if you paid any kind of tax and you were a black man, adult man, you could vote too. So there aren't racial restrictions on this. There are gender restrictions, like women can't vote. And the tax paying requirement was designed, like, it disenfranchised poor people who were exempt from paying taxes because they were too poor, considered too poor to have to pay, which is about the lowest 10%. So it keeps the poor still disenfranchised. And one of the concerns about that, one of the criticisms of lowering or getting rid of property requirements for voting, was the fear was that this was going to lead to corruption, that wealthy men who were very powerful were going to use their economic power to compel people who were indebted to them or who were their employees or their servants vote as they directed. So one of the solutions that they come up with in Pennsylvania for that is a secret ballot, because the idea is that if nobody knows who you're voting for, then you could tell your employer or guy who owns the grist mill or from whom you might have borrowed a bunch of money, who has economic leverage over you. Pennsylvania also gets behind transparency. So secrecy was considered like that's monarchical government. Monarchies and aristocracies operate with secrecy because they are, screwing you out of your money, and they don't want you to know how much how much they despise the people, how much they talk about limiting the powers of the people, and how much the things that they're talking about are about benefiting themselves and members of their class at the public expense. They don't keep records of the assembly in the same kinds of ways. They start doing this with the Continental Congress, and they start taking notes like that. But Pennsylvania is going to do it. It throws open the doors of the legislature and to political reporters who are sitting there and writing down the speeches and writing down who's voting which way. And these are reprinted in newspapers so that citizens can know what they're voting for. They can hold their legislative leaders responsible and accountable, and that's that's a big deal. But that said, just because you put a democratic structure in place does not guarantee democratic results. And I think one of the things that happens that you see in Pennsylvania is that, so there's this democratic revolution in government, but there's not the same kind of corresponding revolution in political culture and voting and voter turnout. I think what happens is that people were so used to their vote not really counting and not voting, and in the 1760s and 70s, the politics that wins the revolution is not electoral politics, right? That doesn't produce the break with Britain. It's protests. It is those iconic movements of like the Stamp Act revolt and the Seaport riots, of which the Boston massacres, the iconic one, but hardly the only one. The mobilizations after the coercive acts in 1774, 1775 are popular groundswells that are happening. It's not people voting, it's people protesting and shutting things down. And so that's the political culture that the revolution creates, is a culture of mobilization on the local level for protest, not a kind of electoral political mobilizing and organizing. And that's a problem once you get to create really Republican form of government like the one in Pennsylvania, which was more democratic than the other states. And so that's going to contain the seeds where things are going to go bad for this popular movement. And I think it's probably the most important lesson of the revolution in terms of thinking about popular mobilizations is this relationship between protest and electoral politics. And the lesson that if you focus exclusively on protesting and popular protesting, and you leave the electoral politics to the other side and said, we can solve this with protesting, you're doomed. That your effort is going to fail because you are handing over power of government, the power to create laws, the power to administer laws, create and administer and run courts of justice and interpret laws. You're handing that over to people who's probably don't support the things you want to do and who are going to use those powers to frustrate anything you're going to try to do, which is exactly what the farmers movement of the 1780s and 90s found out.
Your point about democratic structures not producing necessarily democratic outcomes or just particular outcomes that one might want, maybe that's the better way of putting it.
Right.
I think that is actually the far better way of putting it. Democratic structures not necessarily producing the kind of outcomes that one might want. Because reading this history, okay, we have the 1776 Pennsylvania State Constitution. It has its pros, it has its cons, as you laid out, but the pros are groundbreaking in that sense. And yet, there's, as I understand, still pretty widespread discontent over inequality of property. Many Pennsylvanians are really in debt. Their land and their goods are being seized. The wealth concentration, it sounds like, is not really going away. So I had this thought of, well, okay, did the Constitution do anything necessarily to stop this process? Did ordinary people try to use the new political system to address those economic pressures?
I think it gets back to that question of political culture and whether, because voting is a learned behavior. And this is the beginnings of that kind of shift towards electoral politics. And simply because you have this state, things are relatively democratic structurally on the state level. Again, political culture was still very aristocratic and elite driven, in part because although representatives in the assembly were paid, the pay is not a lot. And it's that it was often wealthy men who were serving in the assembly because they had to pay their own way. And so only rich people could afford to serve in government, which was the whole point, right, of keeping these governments pretty elitist. We're going to see this where we have more democratic structures at the state level. But, at the county level, it's still run by a lot of these like local wealthy powerful families who run things like an aristocracy, which is still true today in rural America. Like the great families who are the dynasty farming families who own a lot of those lands control a lot of politics, and people in rural America who might be unhappy with what they're doing could be upset about that. But challenging that system is really, really dangerous. So it's that, in fact, property inequality that existed that was making, that is an impediment to democratic politics, which is what republicanism warns about. Concentrations of economic power are dangerous to liberty. But in terms of like what's going on, like part of it is that I think one of the things before we talk about like this discontent in the post-war period, 1780s and 90s, like let's talk about its source, which is a total replay of what happens in the 1760s and 70s. And I think this is sort of one of the biggest points the book. Historians of the American Revolution are pretty lousy about money and finance. Just as the colonies had to fight the French and Indian War by printing paper money. When the colonies make the break from Britain, they've got to fund this war, and they don't have gold and silver. So how do they do it? They print paper money. About 80% of the cost of war is funded through paper currencies up until the death of the continental currency. There's terrible wartime inflation, just like in the French and Indian War. And at the end of the war, state governments, and this was a concerted effort across the board, was to try to eliminate government issued paper money. Not just like the continental currency printed by Congress stops trading, but you also see that with states are doing the same things with their own currencies, trying to retire them, get them out of existence, tax them out of existence. So, for example, you get to the point where it's like in Virginia in 1782, at the start of the year, there's like $60 million in Virginia paper money circulating. By the end of the year, it's $1 million left. And you get these same kinds of contraction of the currency happening elsewhere. So they're eliminating paper money, right? Which is 2/3 of the money supply, which is the same thing Britain did with the Currency Act. This is the same. They begin to enact the exact same policies that Britain had enacted to create the revolution. But the results are worse this time because the inflation during the Revolutionary War was way worse. And it leads to this just absolutely terrible depression. Now you're forced to rely on gold and silver. Well, after the Revolutionary War, Britain's closing its harbors to American ships. Other foreign powers are reluctant to open their markets to American shipping. So we're having a hard time getting gold and silver in. You've basically forced America to run on a specie economy, right? A gold and silver economy. You basically force them on the gold standard without gold, and where the supply of gold is just shrinking. And then they go taxing the American people in gold and silver, just like Britain had done. So it's like the playbook, step by step, the policies Britain enacted that created the revolution. The revolutionary elite is enacting the same thing. And it's even sort of worse in all of these regards, also with taxes, because the taxes for the Stamp Act, like those were going to pay for frontier defense. The taxes that are taking folks out in the 1780s and 90s were to pay just the interest payment on the war debt IOU. So the war debt, the domestic part of the Revolutionary War debt, was a whole bunch of IOUs that the Congress issued, mostly at the end of the war, after the continental currency stopped trading. Congress, like, basically had the power to impress goods. Like, so the quartermaster could show up and say, I need these cattle for beef. I need your crops, a wagon, whatever. Here's an IOU for more than they're worth. So that's how we're supplying the army. That's how soldiers were paid their back pay at the end. They go for a year or more without any pay, and at the end, when they're discharged, they're given these IOUs. The IOUs were never worth the amounts printed on their face. They were only ever worth about like an eighth to a tenth or less of their face values. Most of these IOUs and this is by design, concentrate in the hands of the wealthiest American families. Almost the entire war debt is held by about a few thousand people who are all like the wealthiest families in every colony. The concentration is astonishing. It happens pretty early on and stays that way. They'll keep trading it around within their class, but these concentrate pretty early on. And so the taxes are collected and going to wealthy people. In Pennsylvania, they will end up in one case they don't have enough gold and silver to pay out a yearly interest payment to all the holders of the war debt IOUs. And so they print paper money to issue as an annual interest payment. It ends up in the Philadelphia bank accounts of just like 67 people. And the elite knows this is bad. They know this is in terms of what it's doing to the economy. They're all like, "This is terrible." Like this, like when they start cutting paper money and eliminating the money supply. Alexander Hamilton's like, "This is stupid. Like this is crazy. Like you can't do this. Just because you go from an abuse of something doesn't mean you go to like banning paper money." Like he's basically like, "This will cut trade by 80%." Like he's admitting and you find right, like, yeah, the taxes are super heavy. I don't think there's enough gold and silver to pay them, but they're not backing off of it. Like their push is to continue to enforce this tax collection, enforce what they know is hardship on the American public, and creating conditions of economic depression, of mass property foreclosure. When I went to write this book, that wasn't told. That story was nowhere to be found. That the existing literature was talking about Pennsylvania as being prosperous and politically content, and nobody had gone to the court records. The petitions of farmers are saying like, we're getting creamed. And historians have been looking at those petitions and thinking, oh, that's not true, because some, wealthier merchant were saying like they're doing pretty well and talking about acquiring lands and doing, quite, but these folks are very specifically saying you can go to the scenes of distress at our courthouses are like example enough of what's going on, and nobody had gone look at the courthouses. So one of the things I did was places I started my research when this was a dissertation, right, was going out to Pennsylvania courthouses and going in and not knowing, I went in and I said, oh, can I have the sheriff's foreclosures record? And then they would say, you want the execution dockets and papers. And I'm like, no, I don't want like people who are killed. And they're like, no, it's property executions. Like, so they were giving me a legal education. Like, so when you're sued for a debt and you can't pay, the property then has to be put through an execution, which then empowers the court to be able to have a sheriff's auction or hold right to confiscate the property. So I went down to the archives and I asked the archivist, and I'm like, so I want the execution dockets for, 1782 to 92. And she comes back about 15 minutes later. She goes, you want them all? And I'm like, yeah, bring them all. She's like, okay. And she comes back about 15 minutes later. You hear this like squeaky wheel being pushed down in a cart. And she comes out from the archives with a cart stacked up with docket books up to my hip. And I'm like, that's a decade? And she says, like, that's a decade. Like, these are all execution. This is a foreclosures era. She was surprised too. She's like, it's a lot of books. She's like, no one has looked at these things. And that was a reality that wasn't factored into the history, not in terms of understanding what was happening to these people, but understanding the whole politics behind this era. Like that, in my mind, reshapes everything, in terms of thinking about what was happening and what was going on there. And people are that was shaping what their solutions that these farmers were developing. We have no economy without paper money. We need a medium of exchange. We need the government to start printing paper money. Don't tax us in gold and silver. If you're going to tax us in paper money, or tax us in some kind of commodity we have. So, in Virginia, that might have been tobacco, or in Pennsylvania, like wheat or deer skins, like rather than gold and silver. They were like, we shouldn't be taxed so that the people who were issued these IOUs, who got nothing for them, had to sell these IOUs for took my crops and I got this worthless piece of paper I had to sell to some rich guy. Or soldiers who were like, I fought in this war and all I got was this lousy slip of paper, which I couldn't use and had to sell for like an eighth or a tenth of its value. And now, so that some rich guy can get the full face value of it, and I have to pay taxes in gold and silver. This is what we fought a revolution for. And so they started challenging it, saying, let's rescale the war debt to market value. Let's figure out other ways to reduce the burden on the public, so they don't have to face these problems. So the solutions seem pretty reasonable. And then they're like, like we need to spread out economic and political power. And one of the ways to do that, one of the most important ways to ensure that a republic will remain safe, is to make sure that land is widely held in Pennsylvania moving forward. And so they wanted new laws that would limit land speculation, laws that would compel like tax vacant lands that are owned by speculators who are just waiting for the value, keeping them off the market, waiting for the value to go up. Like, tax those lands. And if you tax these guys on lands they're not doing anything with, that they can't make money on, they'll sell them and they'll get put on the market, and that we can get land that's closer to like rivers and waterways and markets, rather than being forced to go deep onto the frontier into Indian territory, which they don't want to do. That's dangerous and frightening, and they'd much rather have lands closer to a market where they can make money selling their crops. So that's sort of the backdrop of it. Like, that's what they're upset about. It's the same damn thing Britain did. And they pointed out, they're like, this is not new. What's happening here is not like this. Didn't we just go through this? And they point out the irony of it. But again, historians, not very good with economics, and in fact, intentionally not paying attention to economics after the big reaction to Charles Beard, who argues that the Constitution was an economic document to protect wealthy men, and he sets up different kinds of property ownership. But Beard is all over the war debt speculation. But the reaction against Beard was so strong that it wasn't just sort of throw out Beard. It was throw out everything having to do with economics or economic self-interest playing a role with the founding elite. Like they're only in it for the ideas. They're only in it for, altruistic problem solving, philosophical reasons. It's not about economic position or gain, which is absurd, as if Charles Beard had the only way to think about how economics might operate. But what you get is generations of historians, particularly those who look at the Constitution's creation, look at the founders in that process, who are ignoring economics, don't even understand it. My one and only conversation with Jack Rakove was with historian Woody Holton, and we were having a conversation, and it was very clear from that conversation. This was outside a hotel party at the AHA, American Historical Association conference. And it was really clear to both Woody and I. We were kind of looking at each other like, Jack didn't quite understand the economics of this period, which was really, I thought, really shocking. Woody and I also had another, we got invited to Harvard to give a paper by Chris Desan, who works on money and culture, and the role of money in the economy and in politics. Really smart scholar. And Woody and I were giving papers about economic interest in the Constitution and the creation. He was doing this stuff on unruly Americans. I was doing sort of the earliest, some of what I've been working on now. We gave our paper, and Pauline Maier, big historian of the Revolution, was there. Bernard Balin was there also. But Pauline Maier goes like, I don't believe you guys. And I'm like, well, what do you mean you don't believe us? And she's like, no, you're calling all these people the founders, and you don't have, like, it's not all the founders. They weren't all like, you didn't show us all of that. You showed us some of them had economic interests influencing them. And I'm like, we got kind of big ones, we got like Washington and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison here. And she's like, I just don't believe it. And so Woody being Woody took over, and Woody was like, well, how many more would you need? How about if we had 10 more? She's like, no. How about a 50 more? And she says, no. And Woody says, is there any number of other founders that we could add or examples that we could provide that would ever change your mind about the role that economics played in all of this and economic self-interest played in this? And Pauline Mayer's response was no, which to my mind, like you're not coming in good faith. Like that's not, if you are automatically dismissed, like that's not what we're supposed to be doing as historians and scholars. Like that's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing. It's not hang on to the story and exclude all of the other. That's what the Supreme Court does, right? We're not supposed to do that. Like we're supposed to be historians. We're supposed to consider it all. And just the absolute reluctance, not just of Pauline Maier to single her out. This is a generational issue with really the Cold War and post-Cold War generations, especially of founder historians who are just flat out ignoring economics as a category of analysis, which is a fatal flaw because there's so much evidence out there about the roles of all this, not just economically, but in terms of ideology and constitutional thought that just have not been explored because these blinders that these folks have put on, this mental block, groupthink, impediment, whatever you want to call it, is fatal to their historical analysis. If you're going to leave out a category like economics, you can do it when you're Gordon Wood or you're Jack Rakove or Pauline Maier or Jack Green, right? But you can't. But come on, like it's methodology too. It's the kind of questions you're asking, right? So it's a group that's looking to understand greatness and character and to credit particular founders with particular parts of the Constitution, right? It's an acceptance of the Constitution as this miracle at Philadelphia. It's like, look at the titles of the books on the Constitutional Convention. Plain, honest men, right? They're not plain. And we'll talk about the honesty part, but it's a particular methodology. Like if you're looking to understand greatness and you're just sifting through records, you don't think economics matters, and you're just trying to understand greatness and you're trying to understand political philosophy, you're looking for the parts of these letters where people are talking about political philosophy. You're not looking at what they're doing to make money. You're not looking at the conversations they're having, which relate to politics and political theory and political ideas, but are coming from a different place, like coming from an economic place, coming from a self-interested place. Like that's different. And if you were leaving that, if that's your methodology, well, of course you're going to get, if you're studying greatness, you're going to get greatness and you're not going to see this other stuff. Whereas if you're taking a broader approach, like not just a intellectual or constitutional historian, but as an historian, right? Where don't pick a particular, like try to figure out what happened as best we can. You're going to learn something different.